线长山又高，处处港口都险要。
Hello and welcome to another episode of Straight Talk with Xiangyu. The information in this episode took a while for me to organize, so please excuse me for the delay in releasing this episode. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll find that it was worth the wait. So, what if I told you Taiwan and North Korea, despite being aligned differently during the Cold War, had one thing in common? Would you believe me? If you haven't dived deep into North Korea, what's one of the first things you think of when they're mentioned? Probably nukes, right? Not only did Taiwan have a nuclear weapons program like North Korea, they both also faced a common obstacle when developing their nukes, namely the United States. And they both proceeded by acquiring knowledge and facilities that could be repurposed for weapons developments under the guise of civilian nuclear development. In other words, both regions pretended to comply with regulations put forth by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, but exploited loopholes and used all sorts of methods to disguise or hide their activities. And they also made concessions with the United States along the way to keep the US off their backs. And they also bought time by using all sorts of tactics and excuses. The only difference was, whereas North Korea successfully detonated a nuclear weapon in 2006, Taiwan was unable to get that far before the US took advantage of Taiwan's political situation in 1988 and forced the shutdown of the nuclear weapons program in its entirety. In no small part with the help from a nuclear scientist turned CIA informant, Chang Hsien-yi. The KMT government never saw the US as a truly reliable ally and thought that the US could turn its back on Taipei and sell them out for their own interests. So it did not like the idea of relying on America's nuclear umbrella as defense against the communists. So it wanted its own nuclear deterrent, kind of like how North Korea wanted a nuclear deterrent to defend itself from potential threats coming from both South Korea and the US. What's different between the two was that the KMT worked closely with the US to procure facilities and materials for its nuclear energy program while covertly running a nuclear weapons program, and thus had to act a little bit more discreetly so as to not lose nuclear support from the US. And until 1979, when the US severed diplomatic ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing, the US had the leverage of threatening to pull its military from Taiwan to keep the KMT in check. So the KMT had to work harder to keep the US happy, while Korea was able to develop its nuclear weapons program a little bit more aggressively, because comparatively they had nothing to lose. Now, both regions had extensive illicit procurement networks to get materials needed, with Taiwan relying on those networks to get more sensitive equipment that it could not procure openly due to its nuclear energy program being heavily scrutinized. So, why nukes? For the KMT, developing nukes meant prestige and independence from the US, and thus upholding the dignity of the Chinese people, since the KMT viewed itself as the rightful representative of all Chinese people at the time. Chiang Kai-shek probably became interested in developing nukes during World War II when the US successfully built atomic bombs. This is evidenced by sending people like Tang Bo-yuan to the UK to receive training, as well as Wu Da-you to the US to study nuclear physics. Wu Da-you would later return to Taiwan and serve as an advisor for the nuclear weapons program for a little bit. However, this was just in his head at the time, in Chiang Kai-shek's head at the time. And between fighting the Chinese Civil War and stabilizing his rule over Taiwan, there wasn't much time or energy to devote to launching a nuclear weapons program. In 1953, US President Eisenhower started this thing called the Atoms for Peace Initiative, which was to take nuclear energy and use it towards constructive things like energy and medicine instead of blowing things up. But it wasn't just one huge hippie fest. It was also about control and preventing other countries from having nuclear weapons. So this program led to the creation of the IAEA in 1957, which is like I said before, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the group that's basically this giant hall monitor for nuclear energy all around the world. And this organization would prove itself to be a giant pain in the ass for the KMT. Chiang Kai-shek kind of played along and publicly pledged that his government would never pursue nuclear weapons, but behind the scenes, he had other plans. In 1955, Taipei signed a nuclear cooperation agreement with the US, paving the way for nuclear infrastructure development on the island. Officially, the focus was on civilian application of nuclear technology. Unofficially, though, Chiang Kai-shek was laying the groundwork for a covert nuclear weapons program. To support this effort, military officers were sent abroad to study in the US and Europe, specializing in fields critical to nuclear development. Back in Taiwan, most of the students at Tsinghua's Institute for Nuclear Science were military personnel, further blending academic research with military ambitions. So under the Atoms for Peace program, the KMT started building a US-supplied nuclear research reactor at Tsinghua University in 1958. This was a 1 megawatt thermal open pool reactor designed to give students hands-on training with nuclear technology. The real push, though, came in 1964, when mainland China successfully tested its first nuclear weapon. This event sent shockwaves, I guess figuratively and literally, throughout the world. It made it clear that the global balance of power had shifted not just between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, but between China and the Soviet Union, as well as China and the US. So in 1965, Chiang Kai-shek put his son, Ching-kuo, then Deputy Defense Minister, in charge of developing a dual-track nuclear strategy, which was to officially focus on civilian nuclear development while secretly including a covert nuclear weapons program. The plan was to develop a latent nuclear weapons capability while remaining a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. And the KMT hoped that it could build its first nuke in secret before either Washington or Beijing could learn about it, and then start building more after that. So the way it worked was the military oversaw the nuclear weapons program, while the Zhongshan Institute of Science and Technology, or the CSIST, handled the research, development, and construction of nuclear weapons, including ensuring a reliable delivery system. The Institute of Nuclear Energy Research, or INER, operated effectively as a division of CSIST, even though on paper they were separate. And the INER focused on producing nuclear explosive materials like weapons-grade plutonium, and it also did things like running nuclear weapons simulations and advancing weapons R&D. INER also served as a civilian cover for the program. But like I said, CSIST and INER were on paper two distinct institutions, despite INER effectively operating as a part of CSIST. I mean, they basically shared the same campus, and there was no physical boundary separating the two. And the two were also, should I say, conveniently located near the National Defense University's Zhongzhen Institute of Technology. So civilian nuclear energy program being located next to a military tech institute. It's just a coincidence, right? Now, CSIST was structured into 4 primary divisions, and INER was basically one of them, specifically tasked with handling the nuclear aspect of the program. The second division focused on mechanical research, particularly for missile development. And the third dealt with electronics. So they did things like, missile guidance systems and other advanced tech. And finally, the fourth division specialized in chemical work, including the development of chemical weapons and missile fuel. So you might wonder, where did the KMT get the idea to organize things this way? To answer this question, we had to look at the other side of Asia, namely the Zionist entity in Palestine. Ernst David Bergman, often referred to as the father of Israel's nuclear weapons program, as well as the head of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, allegedly played a significant advisory role in Taiwan's development of nuclear, missile, and chemical weapons programs during the 1960s. Since Israel was cautious about upsetting either Washington or Beijing, they reportedly tried to limit their assistance to missile and chemical weapons development. However, Bergman believed Taiwan needed a nuclear deterrent and thought Israel's covert approach was the best model for Taiwan to follow. And so he advised Chiang Kai-shek to create an institute to oversee a broader effort with separate focuses on nuclear, missile, and electronic research. And he also suggested establishing institutes for biological and chemical warfare research as a contingency in case the nuclear program was eventually shut down by the US. So it sounds awfully familiar, right? To support this program, Taipei procured materials and equipment under the guise of civilian use, like I said, and turned to illicit networks to acquire sensitive goods. Had the program not been halted by the US, the necessary infrastructure should have been completed somewhere between 1989 and 1991, meaning the KMT was extremely close to getting a nuke. US suspicion and interference posed constant challenges, forcing the Taipei administration to maintain plausible cover stories about the peaceful use of nuclear energy. By the 1980s, the program aimed to develop the capability to produce a nuclear weapon within 3 to 6 months if the government gave the order, while officially denying the existence of a weapons program. Now, achieving this capability required 5 critical conditions. The first was possession of nuclear explosive materials exceeding critical mass, so that's 10 kilos of weapons-grade plutonium or 20 kilos of weapons-grade uranium. The second factor is mastery of high explosive detonation systems and control devices, including the ability to conduct successful cold tests with surrogate nuclear cores. The third condition was the ability to separate high-purity plutonium from irradiated fuel using hot cell facilities, convert it into weapons components, and also handle it safely. Fourth was expertise in refining and shaping plutonium metal for weapons, particularly the lower density delta phase alloyed with materials like gallium. Fifth, a reliable delivery system, such as a modified indigenous defense fighter or ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear payloads. Given Taiwan's dense population, underground nuclear tests were not feasible, so instead the program relied on computer simulations to model nuclear explosions. Leaders prioritized methods to ensure high confidence in the functionality and reliability of nuclear devices without full-scale testing. Other methods like cold tests, which simulate a plutonium implosion device using uranium as a surrogate material for plutonium, were also done to test designs, which was also what Pakistan did in the late 1980s. Because of the 3 to 6 month time frame, personnel had to be prepared in advance. They couldn't afford to start learning or practicing critical tasks like plutonium separation only after receiving orders. So to maintain readiness, the program developed tests with plausible civilian applications such as anti-tank experiments and Moly 99 separation, that's MOLY, Moly, which helped scientists refine relevant skills while maintaining a certain degree of plausible deniability. Now we're going to get into a guy named Chang Hsien-yi. So, how did the US successfully shut down the nuclear weapons program in 1988? One of the first factors was Jiang Jingguo's death in 1988, which meant that then so-called Vice President Li Denghui would serve out the remainder of Jiang Jingguo's term. But the thing is, it took Li Denghui a while to submit his position in the KMT and solidify his position as Jiang Jingguo's successor. Otherwise, he would have just served out Jiang Jingguo's last term until 1990 and get replaced by whoever the KMT wanted. And during this time, the US was very paranoid about the more hawkish faction of the KMT, which they called the Palace faction, which was represented by a man named Hao Bo-chun. They were paranoid about Hao Bo-chun seizing power and accelerating the nuclear weapons program. So they took advantage of the fact that Li Denghui was a complete outsider to the nuclear weapons program, a liberal, and also at the time, a relatively weak figurehead in the government, and they strong-armed him into shutting down the program. And they were able to do this because of this guy, Chang Hsien-yi. By the time he defected to the US under CIA protection, he had already been a key figure in the nuclear weapons program and was the deputy director at INER. He was originally hawkish on Taiwan acquiring nukes to bolster its defense, but over time he became disillusioned with the program, and he was also fearful that Taipei's acquisition of nukes would destabilize the region and possibly cause conflicts that would ultimately be detrimental for the well-being of the people on Taiwan. So in the 1980s, he became a CIA informant, giving the US the information it needed to pressure Taiwan into shutting down its nuclear weapons program. Now, when he first arrived at CSIST, or the Zhongshan Institute of Science and Technology, he was part of a team that developed computer codes to understand the initiation and detonation of nukes. And what he did was study open literature from the US Plowshare's Peaceful Nuclear Explosion Project and literature on reactor safety. Then he obtained unclassified reactor transient codes that he modified for nuclear explosions, focusing on modifying the code for calculating the dynamics of an implosion system. In particular, the simulation of nuclear weapon assembly explosion sequences and the estimation of the explosive yield. So if that sounds complicated, it's because it is. And this guy was a very smart man. In case you don't know, an implosion system is used in nukes that use either plutonium-239 or highly enriched uranium as their fissile material. And its purpose is to create the conditions necessary for a nuclear chain reaction by compressing the fissile core to achieve supercriticality. This was the system that was used in the Fat Man that was dropped over in Nagasaki. Anyways, in 1969, he went on a 2-year scientific exchange to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, ORNL, O-R-N-L. There, he focused on studying reactor safety transients in a nuclear accident, which is a peaceful application, but also not too different from the simulation of nuclear weapons. He learned everything that he could that might help with developing nukes, especially anything related to the dynamics of an implosion device design. Before he left Taiwan for Tennessee, Ching-kuo, who was defense minister at the time, met with him and 2 other students who were also being sent abroad. Now, these students knew that their mission was to further their skills and expand the knowledge needed to advance Taiwan's nuclear weapons program. But they were also told that if they were caught, Taipei would disavow them. Students were sometimes sent abroad with a government minder to keep an eye on their activities because the government had limited funds and it really expected results. So this really isn't too far off from North Korea sending students abroad to study nuclear physics. And I say this because until 1979, the people on Taiwan weren't allowed to travel abroad freely. They needed, government approval. And if you weren't some sort of diplomat, then you were either traveling abroad because you're a student studying abroad or you're a businessman doing business abroad. Now, during Chang Hsien-yi's time at ORNL, he became focused on the ratio of plutonium isotopes and nuclear explosives. From his work at INER, he knew that implosion designs relied on high-purity plutonium, specifically material with a low fraction of plutonium-240. And he was eager to learn more about the isotopic compositions of US nuclear weapons. ORNL held a wealth of unclassified records on Hanford nuclear reactors, which produced plutonium for US nukes. So using this data, Chang Hsien-yi calculated the plutonium isotope fractions in US weapon-grade plutonium from Hanford. He began to think about what fraction of plutonium-240 would be suitable for Taiwan's nuclear weapon design. He asked himself questions like, does the plutonium-240 fraction need to be just a few percent, ensuring high confidence that the explosive yield would be achieved more than 90% of the time? Or could a fraction of 10% plutonium-240 work if a lower confidence level was acceptable? And if so, what impact would that have on the implosion system's pre-detonation probability and the overall yield? So, if that doesn't make sense to you, let me hopefully kind of explain. Plutonium-240 can be used in nuclear weapons, but the preferred isotope is plutonium-239. Plutonium-240 has 240 nucleons, 94 of them being protons and 146 of them being neutrons, while plutonium-239 has 94 protons and 145 neutrons. Plutonium-239 is preferred because it is highly fissile, which means it can easily undergo fission when struck by a neutron, which then releases a large amount of energy and further neutrons to sustain a chain reaction. 240 is also fissile, but it's less efficient for nuclear reactions. It has a higher rate of spontaneous fission meaning it releases neutrons on its own without being struck, which presents problems for weapons because it increases the likelihood of pre-detonation, meaning the weapon could explode prematurely before achieving full compression. As you can imagine, this topic was researched because plutonium-240 is easier to come by. And this is because plutonium is produced in nuclear reactors by irradiating uranium-238 with neutrons. Uranium-238 absorbs a neutron to become uranium-239, which then decays into neptunium-239 and then into plutonium-239. But if the plutonium-239 stays in the reactor for too long, it can absorb additional neutrons and become plutonium-240. And then reactors used for electricity generation, fuel rods are typically left in the reactor for extended periods, leading to higher fractions of plutonium-240 and the resulting plutonium. And remember, Taiwan's nuclear weapons program was done under the guise of a civilian program, so if it could build nukes while avoiding stockpiling large amounts of plutonium-239, the KMT would be in a better position to insist that the program was, for peaceful applications. And when the US started investigating Taiwan's nuclear weapons program, officials in Taiwan would tell inconsistent stories or show the bare minimum and explain the existence of facilities not typically found in civil applications of nuclear energy in very suspicious ways whenever they were pressed. Anyways, Chang Hsien-yi came back to Taiwan to work at INER's reactor physics department, and then from 1972 to 1976, he went and studied abroad again in America to complete his PhD in nuclear engineering at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. After he graduated, he returned to Taiwan and became the leader of the Reactor Control Dynamic Simulation Group at INER. And then he was promoted to lieutenant colonel before becoming one of the deputy directors of INER in 1984. So as a CIA asset, the CIA really couldn't have asked for a much more knowledgeable and high-ranking member of the covert nuclear weapons program. So when did the US start becoming suspicious? The funny thing is, even though it was a covert program, it wasn't that hidden from the US government. And the game was to keep a certain level of plausible deniability. It was kind of like whack-a-mole. The US would find something and then try to whack it, but then the mole would go in and you know what I mean. To put it in terms that anime nerds might understand, it's kind of like how in Death Note, L knew the whole time that Light was Kira, and Light knew that L knew. And the whole game for Light was to keep maintaining a level of plausible deniability by depriving L of the conclusive evidence that he needed. And outside of the Kira task force, nobody ever suspected that Light could have been Kira. So the answer is, the US became suspicious as soon as the program was inaugurated. So around 1966, Chiang Kai-shek made Zhongshan Institute draw up a specific nuclear plan titled the Xiangyu Project. This project included a 5 to 7 year plan aimed at acquiring a heavy water moderated reactor, a heavy water production facility, and a plutonium separation plant. Again, these were ostensibly for peaceful purposes, but were actually intended to support a covert nuclear weapons effort. This project was assigned to Lieutenant General Tang Junbo to oversee, and his responsibilities included procuring the necessary materials and equipment, advancing tech development, and recruiting experts to operate the facilities. Interestingly, the schematics for these proposed facilities bore a striking resemblance to Israel's Dimona nuclear weapons complex near Beersheva. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these places right. Dimona is D-I-M-O-N-A, Beersheva is B-E-R-S-H-E-V-A. And to give context, Israel was at the time on the verge of completing its first nuclear bomb. The US became suspicious that year, so in 1966, when representatives from Taiwan Power Company, or Taipower, asked where a 200 megawatt pilot reactor could be purchased. Not only did they ask this, but they also proposed that the reactor be built on a site that would have placed it under the control of the military and the Zhongshan Institute. Like I said, from the beginning, the CIA was very suspicious that Taipei was trying to build nukes, which we can see from the following passage from the CIA's National Intelligence Estimate in January 1966, which I will now read. There is some evidence that one of Zhongshan Science Research Institute's purposes is to study the possibility of nationalist China's acquiring its own nuclear weapons. Although there are a number of US-educated nationalist Chinese scientists with a high degree of competence in the nuclear field, the Chinese nationalists do not have the capability to produce such weapons domestically. They would have to import unsafeguarded uranium, a suitable reactor, and almost all other necessary equipment. For the next few years at least, we believe that nationalist China would have great difficulty in obtaining such unsafeguarded materials and equipment. So after the US refused to provide the stuff, Taipei tried to approach Israel for additional nuclear technology and facilities. But because Taipei supported Arab votes at the UN, the deal was unsuccessful. So then the Taipei administration tried West Germany and Japan, but Japan refused. However, West German company Siemens eventually entered talks with Taipei. So as we can see, there was expertise, but the main hurdle that they faced was gaining access to technology, and that will be a pretty common theme throughout this episode. So now that we have all the introductory info down, let's get into the history of the program, which spans across 2 decades from the late 1960s until the late 80s, which I'll present year by year as a timeline starting in 1967. 1967. In 1967, the KMT launched a secret nuclear weapons program, and there were initially discussions with Siemens to build 3 facilities for $120 million. But a dude by the name of Wu Dayo, who was then director of the newly formed Committee for Science Development under the National Security Council, advised against this plan. He raised several concerns, including the potential risk for a preemptive strike from the mainland, or Taiwan's lack of sufficient scientific expertise, challenges in sourcing uranium and heavy water, and the danger of the US discovering and shutting down the program. So the covert weapons program was kind of put on the back burner while nuclear research began. 1968. In 1968, Taiwan began receiving substantial international assistance, particularly for civilian nuclear initiatives. The US provided research reactors for peaceful purposes, maintaining a critical yet cautious relationship with the Taiwan authorities. Meanwhile, KMT officials began looking into reprocessing technology, which would allow them to extract plutonium, which, as mentioned previously, is a crucial step towards developing nukes. INER was established in this year under the Atomic Energy Council, but this was basically a formality because although the AEC was a civilian agency under the Executive Yuan, INER's operations were heavily influenced by the military, both in staffing and funding, making it the core institution for Taiwan's covert nuclear weapons program. Making it the core institution for Taiwan's covert nuclear research efforts. 1969. In 1969, the Taiwan administration set up a dedicated nuclear research facility in what was then Longtan Township, Taoyuan County, and what is now Longtan District, Taoyuan City. This research facility was known as the Zhongshan Institute of Science and Technology, or CSIST. With covert support from Israel and South Africa, Taiwan began studying nuclear weapons technology, while the US remained the KMT's most crucial ally, providing economic and military aid. At the same time, Washington was cautious about the KMT's nuclear ambitions. This facility would eventually oversee key parts of Taiwan's military nuclear program, including the new nuclear research reactor at INER. The Executive Yuan and the Zhongshan Institute decided to purchase light water reactors for Taipower and a smaller, heavy water moderated research reactor from Canada. While the light water reactors were for civilian use, the Canadian reactor would, in practice, be controlled by the military. Chiang Kai-shek initially planned to allocate $30 million a year to nuclear R&D, but that figure was reduced to around $10 million before rising again to $15 million after 1970. Construction began in 1969 at INER on the Canadian-supplied 40-megawatt thermal, natural uranium-fueled, heavy water moderated Taiwan Research Reactor, which we will now call the TRR, because I'm not saying all that stuff over again. The TRR. The same type of reactor was used by India for its 1974 underground nuclear test, which India also claimed was for peaceful purposes. The TRR would go critical in January of 1973, making it Taiwan's first local source of weapon-grade plutonium. Canada provided the reactor's initial 25 metric tons of natural uranium fuel and supplied US origin heavy water. The KMT attempted to purchase a relatively large-scale reprocessing facility from the US, but Nixon vetoed this request, fearing that it would contribute to nuclear proliferation. And because of all of this, Washington once again became increasingly wary of Taiwan's efforts to acquire foreign assistance for reprocessing. 1970. Now we get into the 1970s, and as the regional balance of power shifted with the Chinese mainland's growing nuclear capabilities, Taiwan ramped up its nuclear research. During this time period, South Africa is said to have provided Taiwan with access to uranium resources as part of a covert nuclear collaboration. And this partnership was critical for Taiwan's nuclear weapons development, allowing it to secure key materials while avoiding international scrutiny. And now we get into 1971, which we all know was the year that the so-called Republic of China lost its seat in the United Nations to the People's Republic of China. And as a side effect, the so-called ROC, which is in reality the renegade administration of the Taiwan area, gets kicked out of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA. This shift intensified Chiang Kai-shek's resolve to develop nukes, since he felt he could no longer rely on the US nuclear umbrella for protection. In response, he launched what is called the Taoyuan Plan, which set a timeline of 7 to 15 years for Taiwan to acquire the capability to locally produce weapon-grade plutonium through separation of irradiated TRR fuel. To advance this goal, the KMT secretly turned to European countries, many of which were already building domestic reprocessing plants. Some of these countries were willing to export their technology to offset their operating costs. Now, in light of IAEA shifting its recognition from Taipei to Beijing as the representative of China, the IAEA ended negotiations with Taipei. However, an agreement was nonetheless reached for ongoing inspections, and Taiwan's safeguards agreement with the IAEA remained in place. During this time, the KMT decided to build a fuel fabrication plant in Taiwan, with the first fuel element produced in 1974. This timing was likely influenced by the fact that the supply of fuel for the TRR from Canada was no longer guaranteed now that the Taiwan administration lost its spot as China's representative government in the UN. The KMT was also increasingly concerned about the potential nullification of the Mutual Defense Treaty signed between Taipei and Washington back in the 1950s, which further fueled the desire for self-reliance in nuclear security. To produce weapons-grade plutonium, Taiwan needed a steady supply of uranium fuel, which it wanted to get with minimal international scrutiny. And luckily for the KMT, in 1973 and 1974, South Africa secretly agreed to sell natural uranium metal to Taiwan with no strings attached. Taiwan also received uranium from German suppliers under similar covert arrangements. To support its plutonium production efforts, the KMT decided to build a hot cell lab next to the TRR, and this hot cell lab was completed in 1977, allowing for the separation of plutonium from irradiated TRR fuel. I know I jumped a little forward with the years, but now back to 1972. 1972 was the year the US began the process of normalizing relations with Beijing, culminating in President Nixon's handshake with Mao Zedong. As you can guess, this move raised concerns in Taipei about waning US support, and so the KMT responds by continuing nuclear research under deeper secrecy, hoping to develop a nuke as a last resort of sorts should diplomatic support deteriorate. During this time, the US mission to the European Commission in Brussels finds out that Taiwan was seeking a reprocessing plant from contractors in France, Belgium, and Germany, with its preferred partner being a West German company. Alarmed, the US pressured both the West German government as well as Taipei to halt the potential sale. With this maneuvering by the US, America positioned itself as the sole provider of safeguarded nuclear fuel, heavy water, and nuclear-related equipment to Taiwan. However, loopholes in international agreements allowed other countries to supply nuclear materials and equipment to Taiwan without applying IAEA safeguards. Most importantly, though, the agreement with the US included a provision granting Americans the right to conduct snap inspections of nuclear material, further tightening oversight on Taiwan's nuclear activities. 1973. 1973 was a very eventful year, during which reports surfaced highlighting Taiwan's growing interest in nuclear reprocessing technology. Nuclear reprocessing means separating plutonium from spent nuclear fuel and is an important step in developing nukes. This revelation drew significant scrutiny from the US, prompting increased surveillance of Taiwan's peaceful nuclear program. 1973 was also the year when the Canadian-supplied TRR became operational. Without reprocessing capabilities, the plutonium from the TRR remained locked in irradiated fuel and was unusable for weapons. However, Taipei secretly signed a deal with German company UHDE Lurgi, L-U-R-G-I, UHDE-LURGI, for the construction of a reprocessing facility. While the Atomic Energy Council downplayed its scale, the Germans admitted that the plant could process 50 tons of irradiated fuel annually, which is enough to extract several dozens of kilos of weapons-grade plutonium. Taiwan also acquired technical designs and expertise from European reprocessing firms. Furthermore, British Nuclear Fuels Limited, known as BNFL, offered reprocessing services, proposing to process irradiated Taipower reactor fuel and Sellafield Britain, and potentially return the separated plutonium or mixed oxide fuel to Taiwan. The AEC assured that any separated plutonium would go to the US for storage or fabrication into fuel, emphasizing civilian uses. But, of course, the US remained very skeptical. Taipei justified these activities as long-term strategies to address anticipated uranium shortages, but US intelligence nonetheless grew increasingly suspicious, and the CIA assessed that Taiwan could potentially build a nuke by 1976 if its efforts continued unchecked. And so Washington took decisive action, well, kind of decisive, because it didn't really shut down the program. So the US threatened to delay military aid, suspend nuclear energy supplies, and sever military ties unless Taipei halted its nuclear fuel cycle ambitions. And to enforce its stance, the US dispatched a team of experts to inspect Taiwan's nuclear facilities in November of 1973. This team visited INER CSIST, National Tsinghua University, and Taipower's facilities. They met with top officials, including the so-called foreign minister, Shen Changhuan. They reported that INER seemed to have suspiciously unlimited funding, which was pretty inconsistent with peaceful objectives. According to the 1996 congressional testimony of Ambassador James R. Lilly, who was a national intelligence officer in Taiwan during the late 1970s and the director of the AIT in the 1980s, by this point in 1973, the US knew Taiwan was conducting a clandestine nuclear program. Despite this knowledge, the US was kind of in an awkward position because if nuclear support ended abruptly, then it would signal to Beijing that the US was certain Taiwan was building nukes, which the US thought would destabilize the region. So American attempts at halting the program had to be as covert as the nuclear weapons program itself. 1974. In 1974, the first fuel element was produced, and the US is alarmed by reports that Taiwan is developing reprocessing technology that could produce plutonium. As expected, the US presses Taiwan to stop its nuclear weapons research, and Taiwan's leaders responded by publicly agreeing to keep the program limited to peaceful applications, but obviously behind closed doors said fuck you and continued weapons research in secret. 1975. 1975 was the year Chiang Kai-shek died. By then, everyday affairs of the Taiwan area were run by his son Ching-kuo, who would formally become his successor in 1978. This year, 1975, was also when the CIA contacted Chang Hsien-yi for the first time in an attempt to recruit him, but he reportedly refused. According to former Chief of General Staff, General Hao Bo-chun, CSIST scholars were regularly approached for recruitment by the CIA when they were studying abroad in the US, and the CIA wanted them to serve as informants upon returning to Taiwan. And so Taiwan knew about this all the way back then and also ran extensive counterintelligence efforts. So unlike the Taiwan administration today that's totally subservient to the US, as you can see, the KMT back then was constantly annoyed by the fact that it had to rely on the US for all sorts of support, and it constantly went against the will of Washington. And back then, if you were an American living in Taiwan, the KMT operated under the assumption that you were possibly CIA, and you had your phone wiretapped regardless of what your job was. And from everything we've talked about up to now, you can probably see why. And now we get into the stage where the program really revs up from 1976 until the late 1980s. 1976. In 1976, the military sets up an ambitious goal, which was to achieve a working nuclear device by 1980. This program shifted into an advanced phase, focusing heavily on plutonium separation and weaponization technology. By this time, US intelligence had gathered substantial evidence of this covert progress, including reprocessing activities and research tied directly to nuclear weapons development. The Ford administration responded quickly, warning Taipei that continuing its nuclear ambitions could jeopardize its strategic relationship with the US. So, because of this, Taipei once again temporarily paused reprocessing research and reaffirmed its commitment to peaceful nuclear activities, which of course the US didn't really believe. And as you could imagine, US officials grew increasingly doubtful of Taipei's broken promises and lies, especially after learning that INER maintained secret contact with Dutch company Comprimo. The IAEA also increased its oversight and uncovered developments that it found troubling. Inspectors discovered an undeclared lab where plutonium metal had been produced from US-supplied separated plutonium. IAEA General Rudolf Ramech requested access to the plutonium fuel chemistry lab and initially faced resistance from INER officials before they reluctantly allowed the inspection. During dinner with INER staff that meeting, Ramech pointed out that the activities he had seen far exceeded those typically associated with civilian nuclear programs. And so in July, the IAEA conducted a comprehensive inspection at INER to verify Taiwan's nuclear materials inventory and investigate whether non-safeguarded uranium had been introduced into the TRR. The agency also pressured Taiwan to declare additional facilities for routine inspections, further tightening scrutiny. Meanwhile, the US intelligence community strategically leaked info about Taiwan's nuclear activities to the media. The reports that came out on the secret reprocessing efforts and potential missing fuel elements added public pressure and pushed Taipei to slow its nuclear ambitions. But as you can expect, the KMT remained determined to pursue nuclear capabilities. So, say what you will of the KMT, but back during the White Terror days, they kind of had balls. 1977. Now we're getting into one of the most important years of the cat and mouse game that Washington and Taipei were playing with one another. In 1977, the CIA ramped up its surveillance of Taiwan's nuclear program once again, and the IAEA unearthed new concerns. Inspectors discovered that some fuel elements at the TRR contained significantly less uranium than expected, just 70% of the typical amount, so 39 kilos instead of the expected 54. This discrepancy hinted at a possible diversion for weapons-related purposes. The US therefore sent a high-level inspection team in January, and the delegation included a mix of experts, Burton Levin from the State Department, who was fluent in Mandarin, Gerard Helfrich from the Energy Research and Development Administration, George Menzel of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, Raymond Weimer from Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Murray Cavanaugh from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and State Department officials Alan Locke and Dean Cooper. Their 3-week mission was to investigate and reiterate the scope of permissible nuclear activities in Taiwan. And of course, the KMT was not very eager to cooperate. INER scientists pushed back against US directives of so-called Vice Foreign Minister Chen expressed frustration over perceived hypocrisy, and in a very extraordinary move, the KMT hosted a fancy dinner for the US team, complete with scantily clad dancers offering private companionship. This gesture was seemingly aimed at, winning favors or creating blackmail opportunities, but these team members weren't simps, and so they rejected these generous offers. Initially, inspections didn't lead to much. However, the team discovered critical evidence in the nuclear waste inventory at the plutonium fuel chemistry lab. These records revealed fission products from at least one spill, indicating that plutonium separation had occurred. Adding to suspicions, segmented fuel elements were discovered on the floor of the fuel fabrication building. These elements looked just like normal ones, but were specifically designed for covert diversion. Their design allowed them to be cut into pieces without contaminating the cooling pond, making them easier to transport to unmonitored locations, possibly an off-site reprocessing facility. There were also allegations that sensitive equipment had been moved before the US team's arrival, which further complicated their search efforts. But by April, Washington had enough and presented Taipei with a list of 6 demands, delivered through Ambassador Leonard Unger to Ching-kuo. And these demands included: 1. Extending US-Taiwan Atomic Energy Agreement safeguards to all nuclear materials and facilities. 2. Establishing mutually acceptable methods for disposing of spent nuclear fuel. 3. Terminating programs involving plutonium handling, uranium enrichment, and heavy water production. 4. Transferring existing plutonium holdings to the US with compensation. 5. Avoiding activities that could lead to nuclear explosive capabilities. And 6. Temporarily suspending operations at the TRR until safeguards were in place. Now, Taipei was expected to fully imply. In fact, Taipei's response saying that they would agree to all of this was already pre-written by the US for Jiang Jingguo to sign. And the US offered support for civilian activities in return. By May, inspections indicated initial compliance. However, do I even need to say it? INER scientists continued to discreetly advance weapons-related research. Chang Hsien-yi, who returned to INER that year, so 1977, described a team of 10 to 12 experts working on computer codes for nuclear weapons. Despite limited computational resources, they expanded simulations to 2 dimensions and began preliminary 3D modeling. Parallel high explosive tests refined the parameters for these simulations. They used a CDC Cyber 70 computer, which was the most advanced in Taiwan at the time, accessible remotely from CSIST, INER, and some other locations. These simulations were run very carefully, and they avoided transmitting sensitive data via phone lines to prevent interception. As simulation codes advanced, they approached capacity limits, and Taipei sought to get more powerful computer technology. But it also had to deal with a very highly suspicious US. Chang Hsien-yi also witnessed a working nuclear weapon model, a spherical device that was like a soccer ball with a 32-point detonation system designed to compress the nuclear core symmetrically. By June of 1977, INER had completed its hot laboratory, advancing their capabilities further. And the IAEA was also working hard. Its Far East Safeguard section concluded that 9 or 10 fuel elements had been diverted, and US officials theorized the detailed process, which was they thought elements were fabricated, irradiated, and then covertly cut into pieces at the reactor site, and then these pieces were probably transported via a canal gate in a transfer flask to an unknown reprocessing facility, possibly near the Shimen Dam, although the site was never found. By the end of 1977, a denuclearization plan was finalized, with Taipei agreeing to strict oversight and dismantling facilities. The TRR was shut down for 15 months, and its spent fuel was moved to secure storage. Reprocessing facilities, including Norway-supplied equipment, were dismantled. Taiwan also returned 863 grams of U.S. origin plutonium, and when all this happened, safeguards became even stricter, with the U.S. and IAEA gaining unrestricted access to all nuclear materials and facilities. Obviously, the military was very pissed. Many of their secret procurement channels were now under intense U.S. surveillance, making it harder for them to get sensitive materials. But despite all this, Taiwan's nuclear scientists continued their work, and they continued carefully disguising weapons research as civilian activity. Now, part of the deal that Taiwan had with the U.S. was to convert the TRR to low-enriched uranium fuel, and this was meant to reduce proliferation risks, but the KMT kind of stalled. Plans were set to have it partially converted in 1981, but this process was slow because of political and technical hurdles. And by 1986, the reactor was still using natural uranium, so you can see how reluctant the KMT was at actually complying with US demands. Throughout 1977, Taipei's nuclear ambitions became more and more sophisticated and secretive, driven by the calculated strategy of complying just enough to placate the US while pursuing security goals under the radar. This delicate balancing act defined the era and set the stage for continued tensions between Taipei and Washington. 1978. In 1978, under Jimmy Carter, the US intensified pressure on Taipei to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This was part of a broader effort to ensure Taipei abandoned its nuclear weapons program. In exchange for continued US military support, Taipei officially agreed to stop all nuclear weapons development, and as you'd expect, the US remained very skeptical. I feel like a broken record at this point. Despite these assurances, reports emerged of continued work in areas like laser enrichment of uranium and heavy water production, which the US thought were activities that directly violated the April 1977 agreement. So, the US sent another inspection team to Taiwan, restating expectations and reiterating the importance of non-proliferation. And KMT officials reaffirmed their commitments, but of course the US was not fully convinced. And so Ambassador Leonard Unger expressed particular concerns to CSIST Director General Tang, noting the ongoing close relationship between CSIST and INER. The collaboration raised doubts about whether INER's research was genuinely limited to peaceful purposes. Throughout the summer of 1978, reports continued to surface about experiments related to laser isotope separation. While not explicitly prohibited by the 1977 agreement, this technique could lead to uranium enrichment, which is an essential step in developing nuclear weapons. America's position was pretty clear. Taipei had committed to stopping all activities that could lead to enrichment capabilities, not just the act of enrichment itself, but Taipei had a different understanding of the agreements and was exploiting loopholes. Further complicating things, heavy water production equipment was allegedly concealed during a US inspection visit. While officials toured facilities in northern Taiwan, the equipment was reportedly hidden in the south. And these evasive tactics deepened Washington's mistrust. In September, U.S. Ambassador Unger delivered a new démarche to Ching-kuo, emphasizing American concerns and expectations. Ching-kuo's response was one of frustration and anger. He was basically like, man, we're already meeting all U.S. demands, and then he accused Washington of undermining the morale of Taiwan's scientists and technical experts. Ching-kuo also noted that his government had deliberately avoided publicizing U.S. interference to prevent anti-American sentiment from flaring up. Now, despite his very visible irritation, Ching-kuo reassured Ambassador Unger that Taipei would refrain from any activities leading to nuclear proliferation. Now, by the end of 1978, there were still problems. Taiwan was outwardly complying with US demands, but kind of continued to skirt the edges of its commitments. which left the US very wary of the KMT's true intentions. So you can probably see by now why the US covertly supported the liberal opposition movement against the KMT and later the liberal faction within the KMT, because the KMT had too many ideas of its own that the US really didn't like, just like I've previously said on this show and on my appearances on other shows like Carl Zah's Silk and Steel podcast. Now, going to the next year, 1979, which was another pretty big year. Not a whole lot happened in terms of the nuclear weapons program, but the diplomatic situation changed significantly. The US officially switched its diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing, and this development compounded Taiwan's security concerns, as the Mutual Defense Treaty signed by Taipei and Washington was set to terminate 1 year after Washington's diplomatic ties with Beijing were established, so 1980. With fears of US abandonment looming large, Taipei secretly resumed its nuclear weapons program. The termination of formal diplomatic ties meant that the US had lost a crucial lever for pressuring Taiwan to fully dismantle its nuclear ambitions, because now it can't be like, oh, if you don't cooperate with us, then we'll switch recognition to Beijing, because it kind of already happened. Now, that same year, Taiwan's hot laboratory was finally commissioned. By this point, TRR had already generated enough plutonium in its irradiated fuel for several small nuclear weapons. However, the long-discussed TRR core conversion and the repatriation of its irradiated fuel remained unresolved and years away from implementation. This left US officials very uneasy, and their estimates suggested that Taiwan could produce its first nuclear weapon in as little as 2 years if left unchecked. And starting in this year, so 1979, an unusual line of communication opened between Beijing and Washington. Officials from both sides began meeting at opera performances to discreetly exchange information and discuss findings related to Taiwan's nuclear activities, particularly developments at INER and CSIST. While the Chinese mainland likely had its own agents embedded within Taiwan, the CIA seemed to have access to higher-level informants, giving the US a critical edge in better understanding the situation. By the end of the year, the strategic landscape had dramatically shifted. Taiwan's nuclear ambitions were reignited, covert efforts continued, and the US continued to keep a close eye on Taiwan. And now we're headed into the 1980s. 1980. The 1980s are pretty interesting because we see the KMT pressing forward with a nuclear weapons program until it was ultimately shut down in 1988. And this was a very awkward time for the KMT because it had lost diplomatic ties with the US, which was a devastating blow to those trying to maintain the claim that the so-called Republic of China was a legitimate Chinese government. And at the same time, Taiwan separatists in America were ramping up their activities, and the liberal opposition movement against the KMT was in full swing in Taiwan. And both the liberal opposition movement as well as the Taiwan separatists in America received some level of tacit and covert support from the US, especially from human rights groups as well as Baizuo activists. So it goes without saying that the KMT was increasingly faced with mounting pressure from within and without. In 1980, Taipei pressed forward with developing a reprocessing facility capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium, which once again raised concerns in Washington. Diplomatic ties between Beijing and Washington were still kind of new, and the US did not want to risk a Cross-Strait arms race. So it was trying to maintain a balance of having diplomatic ties with Beijing while still getting what it wanted out of Taiwan. And so to placate the administration in Taipei, the US approved the backlog of nuclear exports previously ordered by Taiwan's Atomic Energy Commission, INER, as well as Taipower. In December of 1980, the Taiwan administration's so-called Ministry of Defense made a public declaration saying that Taipei would never pursue the development of nuclear weapons. Now, despite this reassurance, tensions remained high, and the US deliberated over an offer by Ching-kuo to send an American scientist to Taiwan to assume a technical post at INER and CSIST. Ultimately, however, Washington decided against it because it thought that such a move might inadvertently signal to Beijing of US suspicions, which would risk further conflict. And as we later find out, The US really did not need to embed an American scientist in Taiwan's program because by the early 1980s, the CIA had finally successfully recruited the star of this episode, its high-level informant Chang Hsien-yi. He began working for the CIA in either 1981 or 1982 after being approached during a conference in the US. A CIA officer appealed to his sense of duty, emphasizing that nuclear weapons would destabilize the region and jeopardize the safety of the people on Taiwan. And over time, Chang Hsien-yi grew disillusioned with the pursuit of nukes, and his beliefs made a 180 as he became a key asset for the US. Interestingly, perhaps, was the fact that the CIA's initial target had been General Tang Junbo, a more senior figure in the nuclear weapons program. But they ended up settling for Chang Hsien-yi, who was in General Tang Junbo's inner circle and therefore privy to critical information. Throughout the 1980s, Taiwan focused on enrichment and constructing hot cells, which are facilities capable of processing irradiated fuel and separating plutonium. The cover story for these hot cells was civilian medical applications, and a hospital was even planned, ostensibly to use medical isotopes derived from the hot cells for patient treatments. And this allowed INER to hone its expertise in separating isotopes like Moly-99 for medical purposes, while also preparing the groundwork for plutonium separation. Again, this dual-purpose strategy reflected the lengths Taipei was willing to go in pursuit of nukes, even under the watchful eyes of both so-called allies and adversaries. Also, the first half of the 1980s was when Ching-kuo followed up the 10 major construction projects with the new development projects, which included significant investments in Taiwan's integrated circuit industry and the creation of science and technology parks, most notably Hsinchu's Science and Industrial Park, often referred to as the Silicon Valley of Taiwan. And this worked well for the nuclear weapons program because acquiring and developing fast electronics had been a huge priority for CSIST. And now we go into 1981. 1981, General Hao Bo-chun was appointed Chief of General Staff of the so-called ROC's armed forces, becoming the primary military officer overseeing the success of the nuclear weapons program. He was a staunch anti-communist hawk, but he was also a hardcore Chinese patriot, opposed to the CIA's influence in China's affairs, including what went on in Taiwan, and he also stood firmly against Taiwan separatism. A little fun fact, a lot of the top brass in the military today joined the military when Hao Bo-chun was in charge, so interpret that however you will. Anyways, under his leadership, the nuclear program gained new momentum. The leader of the Taiwan area at the time, Jiang Jingguo, shared a delicate consensus with Hao Bo-chun and the military. Jiang Jingguo aimed to develop the capability to build nukes without actually constructing them, while the military sought to advance the program under the guise of civilian research. Both sides agreed to tread cautiously, avoiding any overt provocation of the US. And their shared objective was clear, which was to achieve the capability to produce a nuke within 3 to 6 months if the government ever issued the order. Hao Bo-chun believed that merely developing the ability to make nukes did not breach the 1977 agreement with the US as long as no actual bombs were manufactured. This interpretation became a cornerstone of his efforts to expand the program throughout the 1980s, a period during which he played a dominant role until stepping down from his military position in 1989, which was the result of the Deng Hui's power play that I'll get into later at some other time. Washington was alarmed when Hao Bo-chun was initially named president of the CSIST, so the US pressed Jiang Jingguo to appoint a civilian head instead. In response, Jiang Jingguo chose a dude named Huang Xiaozong to replace Hao Bo-chun. The word on the street was Huang Xiaozong was little more than a puppet for Hao Bo-chun. Hao Bo-chun saw US restrictions on Taipei's nuclear ambitions as a humiliating imposition on Chinese sovereignty and therefore believed that total reliance on the US was a dangerous gamble. But he also recognized that severing the remaining informal ties with Washington would be impractical. So his vision was asserting the so-called ROC's autonomy while maintaining a fragile balancing act with the US, which shaped the nuclear program for nearly a decade and almost successfully made Taiwan go nuclear. So you can see why the US really did not like this guy and essentially launched an internal coup within the KMT over the course of the 1980s and 1990s. 1982. In 1982, the US signed a third joint communique with Beijing, this time pledging to gradually reduce arms sales to Taiwan, a move that only deepened Taipei's fears of being sidelined. In response, Ching-kuo made a public declaration, and he claimed that Taiwan had the ability to develop nuclear weapons. But this bold claim was quickly walked back by the Executive Yuan, which reiterated the government's official opposition to pursuing nuclear arms. Behind closed doors, though, sentiments were closer to the declaration made by Jiang Jingguo. INER internally claimed that it already had the capacity to produce nuclear weapons, while General Hao Bo-chun sought to secure uranium for the program by striking a deal with South Africa. In his agreement with the South Africans, Taiwan would provide nuclear expertise in exchange for uranium. And this collaboration took shape as INER began sending teams to Johannesburg on a periodic basis. Hao Bo-chun also wanted a fusion research center to be set up at CSIST to train high-energy physicists interested in this area and acquire necessary equipment. 1983. In 1983, Hao Bo-chun delivered a clear directive to INER staff: maintain and enhance their capabilities to produce nukes, acquire another small nuclear reactor, and wear America's scrutiny of INER as a badge of honor. He basically said America wouldn't be all up in their shit if they weren't doing good work. While this was going on, South Africa solidified its role as a willing partner in these covert efforts, agreeing to collaborate on laser enrichment research and even proposed building a small nuclear reactor in Taiwan. At the time, South Africa was in the early stages of its own secretive nuclear project, a 150 megawatt thermal reactor designed to produce both plutonium and tritium for nuclear weapons. Hao Bo-chun openly informed James R. Lilly, who was then the director of the American Institute in Taiwan and a former CIA station chief, about these plans to work on laser enrichment and acquire a small reactor. But Hao Bo-chun strategically omitted any mention of Taiwan's chemical enrichment collaboration with the South Africans. On the ground, INER had achieved a modest milestone, which was enriching uranium chemically to 0.75% uranium-235, slightly above its natural level of 0.71%. Researchers assured Hao Bo-chun they could reach 3% enrichment within 3 to 5 years, sufficient for powering reactors without reliance on US-supplied enriched uranium, though far from the 85% required for nuclear weapons. It was a calculated move to bolster self-sufficiency while staying under the threshold of overt provocation. 1984. By 1984, the US was growing increasingly suspicious of Taiwan's covert activities, because to US officials, that 3% uranium enrichment didn't just mean nuclear energy independence. It meant Taiwan could quickly pivot to producing highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons with only marginal additional effort. This concern put immense pressure on Taiwan's leadership. So Hao Bo-chun proposed a temporary pause in sensitive work during US inspections, only to resume afterwards. Jiang Jingguo had the idea of pushing for Taiwan to exit the restrictive 1977 agreement altogether. And amid these tensions, Chang Hsien-yi, our high-ranking nuclear scientist star of the episode, officially agreed to serve as a CIA informant. He passed a polygraph test at a discreet location and was offered protection for himself and his family, though the CIA admitted they couldn't guarantee his absolute safety. Over the years, Chang Hsien-yi would take multiple polygraph tests to maintain CIA trust. Now, Chang Hsien-yi's handlers met him at a CIA safe house near Taipei's Shilin night market every few months. As one of INER's 4 deputy directors in 1984, Chang Hsien-yi's job included crafting civilian cover stories for Taiwan's nuclear projects. If a credible civilian rationale couldn't be devised for a particular initiative, the work would halt. This position allowed him to confirm CIA intelligence, report new developments, and discreetly investigate procurement budgets to glean additional information. Chang Hsien-yi's reputation as a nuclear hawk enabled him to gain the trust of Taiwan's senior officials who shared a lot of sensitive details with him. This privileged access made him a very valuable source for the CIA, who provided insights into Taiwan's nuclear intentions and capabilities that very few other people could. Now, that year, so 1984, Taiwan procured a high-temperature vacuum induction furnace from abroad, which was a key piece of equipment for melting and casting uranium and plutonium, which are critical steps in manufacturing nuclear weapons components. Now, on to the next year, 1985. In 1985, Taiwan's nuclear program continued to advance despite external and internal challenges. South Africa, one of the nuclear weapons program's key partners, faced significant budget constraints and scaled back its small reactor project, which would ultimately be canceled in 1989. Nonetheless, Taipei pressed forward with its own developments. That year, a critical milestone was achieved: a successful cold test of a nuclear device design. This test was conducted at Zhoupeng, a remote military facility in southern Taiwan, in Pingdong County. While no nuclear material was involved, the data collected was instrumental for further development. These results were transmitted to a simulation team which analyzed the findings using a supercomputer, and then this analysis allowed Taiwan's experts to revise and optimize the design, bringing them one step closer to a viable nuclear weapon. Now, despite South Africa's retreat, Taipei's determination to progress underscored its resolve to maintain strategic options in the face of growing isolation and security concerns. 1986. In 1986, the focus of Taiwan's nuclear program remained on refining its capabilities to ensure readiness. General Ye and Director Liu of INER determined that by improving access to critical materials and refining existing techniques, they could significantly reduce the time required to produce a nuclear weapon. Their assessment concluded that under optimal conditions, Taiwan could develop a functional nuclear device within 3 to 6 months if the command were given. Their revelation highlighted the program's advanced state and the persistent dual challenge Taiwan faced, which was navigating US oversight while maintaining the ability to build anew quickly if needed. The emphasis was on preparedness, ensuring that Taipei had the technical and material capability to act decisively if the administration ever came under direct threat. 1987. In 1987, the CIA uncovered compelling evidence of Taiwan's significant weaponization efforts. The findings included the construction of a prototype nuclear bomb and tests conducted on its critical components. Taiwan's nuclear program had matured over the years, and researchers were in the process of transitioning from spherical implosion designs to more sophisticated miniaturized devices capable of being mounted on locally manufactured attack aircraft. By this time, researchers had achieved precision improvements in microswitching timing and reduced delays from microseconds to an impressive 100 nanoseconds. The nuclear warhead design was nearing completion with a diameter of approximately 60 to 70 centimeters and a mass reaching 900 kilograms. However, further miniaturization was necessary because to fit the warhead into an external fuel tank under Taiwan's indigenously developed attack aircraft, the warhead's diameter would need to shrink to 50 centimeters. Taiwan scientists demonstrated the effectiveness of their computer simulations and experimental data, proving that they were technically capable of designing functioning nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, the development of Taiwan's indigenous defense fighter aircraft was also advancing rapidly. These aircraft were completed in late 1988 and were named Ching-kuo after the late Ching-kuo, who died in early 1988. While President Reagan had previously blocked the sale of F-16 and F-104 aircraft to Taiwan during the early 1980s in an effort to improve Sino-American relations, he did allow US companies to provide technical assistance for Taiwan's indigenous aircraft program. 1988. Now, this is the year where things take a dramatic turn, with decades of painstaking effort practically vanishing overnight. In January 1988, a dramatic turn of events unfolded as Chang Hsien-yi defected to the United States. Chang Hsien-yi carried with him a trove of documents that exposed the full extent of Taiwan's nuclear weapons program, confirming years of CIA suspicions. Needless to say, his defection shocked and angered KMT leadership. Evidence revealed that the TRR had produced nearly 85 kilos of plutonium, much of it weapon grade or near weapon grade. Researchers at INER had also determined that non-weapon grade plutonium could still be used in nuclear explosives, albeit with reduced yielding reliability. But this was considered acceptable since the program's primary aim was deterrence rather than deployment. Chang Hsien-yi's defection came at a critical moment because Taiwan had been building a plutonium separation plant at a CSIST military site that was capable of producing 10 to 20 kilos of plutonium annually. Construction, which began in 1983, was nearly complete. Specialized equipment, such as manipulators for safely handling radioactive materials, had already been installed too. Chang Hsien-yi's escape was orchestrated with great precision. On January 8, 1988, he sent his wife and children to Disneyland in Tokyo, and then he told his colleagues that he'd be joining them and would return to work on the 12th. But what really happened was he went to a CIA safe house, and then when his wife landed in Tokyo, a woman handed her a letter written by Chang Hsien-yi informing her of the defection and that he will reunite with her in Seattle. By the next day, he was on a plane to Hong Kong and then Seattle, traveling under a new name with a new passport with his picture. He reunited with his family in Seattle, and then by January 12th, they were all in Washington, D.C. The timing of Chang Hsien-yi's defection was interesting too, because Ching-kuo died on January 13th, leaving so-called Vice President Li Denghui to step into the leadership. Li Denghui, like I said previously, was an outsider to the Jiang family, and he faced skepticism from the US about his ability to control the military, and in particular, his ability to control General Hao Bo-chun, who was seen as the problematic hawk. Fearing that Hao Bo-chun would continue or accelerate the nuclear weapons program or even launch a coup against Li Denghui, the US acted very swiftly. First, Ronald Reagan sent a letter to Li Denghui calling for cooperation to ensure Taiwan's nuclear program was truly peaceful. Then the CIA consulted Chang Hsien-yi about how Hao Bo-chun should be dealt with. And Chang Hsien-yi suggested that Hao Bo-chun should be kept in power, but that they had to communicate to him that he had crossed the red line and had to change course. Chang Hsien-yi thought handling the situation carefully was important so as to prevent an exodus of staff at INER with dangerous know-how to other countries. Now, keeping Hao Bo-chun in power in Chang Hsien-yi's mind would help maintain morale as well as overall stability, and it was also for this reason that Chang Hsien-yi advised against totally dissolving INER, but instead to divorce it from anything related to nuclear weapons. And so AIT Director David Dean met with Hao Bo-chun and presented evidence of high-explosive nuclear tests at the Zhoupeng military missile testing range. David Dean demanded the immediate dismantlement of Taiwan's nuclear program, and the role that Chang Hsien-yi played was he provided the US with irrefutable evidence of a nuclear weapons program that the Taiwan administration could no longer plausibly deny whatsoever. And with the US threatening to pull back support, the KMT was left with no other option. By the end of January, the TRR was shut down and heavy water was removed. Plans to ship irradiated fuel and heavy water to the US were finally put into motion, and weapons-related nuclear facilities were starting to get dismantled. Furthermore, computer codes related to nuclear development were destroyed as well. Now, Taipei publicly cited economic reasons for the reactor's closure, but the truth was clear. The island was being thoroughly denuclearized. To ensure no possibility of resurgence, the US pushed for administrative restructuring. INER was placed under the Atomic Energy Council for real this time, and its budget shifted from the Defense Department to the Education Department. And to physically separate INER from CSIST, a fence was built, so it was no longer a single campus. Taiwan's nuclear ambitions finally turned towards civilian applications for real this time, with the US maintaining a close oversight to prevent any revival of weapons development. The era of Taiwan's covert nuclear weapons program had come to a definitive end. So as we can see, Taiwan was very close to developing a nuclear weapon despite all sorts of technical limitations and US interference. Perhaps the change in nuclear policy is a reflection of the broader relationship between Taiwan and the US, Whereas during the days of Chiang Kai-shek and Ching-kuo, Taiwan operated with a certain degree of autonomy from the US despite its status as a US client. But ever since Lee came into power, it's relinquished any semblance of autonomy that it's exercised and has become a greater puppet than before. Though this development is conveniently framed by defenders of US hegemony as rule of law or democracy. The way the US government spoke on how to deal with Haobo also showed that the US was willing and able to launch coups within Taiwan, and that the KMT back then was not a total puppet of the US, but a political party that, at the very least, struggled to maintain a degree of autonomy from the US while leveraging US support for its ends, which cannot be said of the DPP administration in power today. So, if you've made it this far, I hope you found this episode informative and interesting. And if you're new to the show and find this sort of content interesting, please make sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and also give me a follow on social media. A like or comment on YouTube is greatly appreciated. And if you really want to support me sharing a perspective of Taiwan, mainland China, and beyond not typically covered by Western mainstream media, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon, becoming a member of this channel, or making a one-time donation to any of the links in the show notes. As always, if you got any feedback, comments, or ideas for the show, please feel free to email me at straighttalk@xiangyu.tw. I would now like to give a huge shout out to my patrons and members: Alvin Zhao, Wang Yijing, Pranav Simma, Michael Kim, Victor, Alaskan Lambridge, Project CD14039, Jim Fox, and Kabaseta Fogo. Your support means a lot to me and really helps keep the show going. Thank you all for tuning in, and see you guys in the next episode.
还是